All right, Professor Klein back here in the hospital surgery room. Just did some brain surgery because I had to bring out a human brain to teach you guys today on the nervous system, brain, spinal cord, and how to assess those areas of the body. So we're going to dive into the different structures of the brain. You're going to do some really cool things this week in lab with the brain and the spinal cord. But let's start with an overview on the brain here. As you can see it, I usually start with a colored version of the brain so you can see the different lobes and structures, and then work your way more towards how the brain might actually look in the body. Not so many colors, right? Just brain tissue right here. Now, if we're looking at the brain, we can see the four main lobes of the brain. We got the frontal lobe, we got the parietal lobe, occipital, and temporal. Now, in addition to knowing the location and anatomy, you want to know a little bit about the general function. So, for example, the frontal lobe is your personality. It's your higher level thinking. It's your voluntary motor movement. All comes from that frontal lobe. Next up is the parietal lobe. This is more, not so much movement, but sensation, feeling, thinking, understanding what your body is receiving from the external environment is the parietal lobe. Now, occipital lobe kind of sounds like occipital, orbital. That's your eye, that's vision. So the occipital lobe deals with visual processing. And if your eyes are up here, they got to send information all the way to the back to process. Now, something that doesn't have to travel as far is hearing. And that's going straight to your temporal lobe, which is on the side, lateral sides of your brain, closest to your ears. In addition to that, you've got the cerebellum and the brainstem, deeper, lower level parts of the brain that deal with breathing and heart rate and just keeping you alive. And that's an overview of the brain. But there's not just the outside of the brain here. There's also the internal structures. Now, this is a big old picture that labels all of them, but there's also a video going through this entire brain. So stop this video, take a second, check out the human brain video down here as it covers all the internal structures of the brain. So take a little bit of time to do that right now. All right, so that was a quick check on the human brain. Keep watching that video and reviewing until you know all the structures of the brain. But there is a few structures that might not pop off the brain as easily, and these are called the ventricles. So what are ventricles and what is the ventricular model? Well, ventricles are empty space in your brain. So this is a casting of empty space. If I were to touch these areas in the brain, I'd be touching empty space. So there's a video to go through all the different ventricles on the ventricle model. But as you can see, there's a lateral ventricle. Number one right here, lateral. There's a third ventricle, which is the second type. And there's a fourth ventricle. So no first, no second, but there's a lateral, a third, and a fourth ventricle. Those are the three ventricles of the brain. And I think in your lab manual, there's questions on this, so feel free to add these in as we go throughout this video. All right, so pause the video and watch the ventricular model, and then I've got one wrap-up question for you after you watch that video. All right, welcome back from watching the video. Here's my wrap-up question. What is the pink structure? Look real close here. What is the pink structure on this model? There's a name for this pink structure on this model, and what is the function? So name the pink structure as well as the function. And if you are thinking the answer is choroid plexus, you'd be correct. It's actually shown right here on this model. Hard to see, but that's the pink stuff, the choroid plexus. It's also down in the fourth ventricle as well. What's it do? The answer? It produces cerebral spinal fluid, often abbreviated in CSF. This is going to lubricate and cushion your brain and suspend it in some fluid. If you didn't have CSF, your brain and your skull would rub against one another. So imagine there being nothing in between here. You need that CSF to suspend and protect the brain. All right, enough on ventricles. Here's another way that the brain is protected, and it's called the meninges. So the meninges, I want you to think of them as the layers surrounding the brain. As you can see right here, we've got the actual brain tissue, but then notice there's some layers surrounding the brain, and these layers are called the meninges. Now, same thing as the CSF, this is gonna protect the brain from the skull. If we didn't have meninges, there'd be a lot of friction between the brain and the skull. So we are thankful and grateful for the meninges in our brain. Now let's look at them here. There is a video for it. Check out the video with the meninge model. But here we can see a picture of all the layers. I love this because you can see it from the scalp, which is something you can all see externally on a human, to the skull. And then we've got the three different meninges, from superficial to deep. They are the dura mater, including a perosteal and meningeal layer, but together that's the dura mater. Then we've got the arachnoid mater, the next deepest. And finally, the most deep, the pia mater. So the three different meningeal layers are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater being most deep. Now, if you watch that video, you would know that the pia mater actually is the only one that goes deep within the brain. So this is the brain down here. Let me give it a B for brain, cerebral cortex. That is the brain. But the brain has what's called sulci and gyri. Your sulci are these divots, these valleys. And in the valleys, or the sulci, the pia mater travels down those valleys, but no other meningeal layer does that. Notice how the arachnoid mater, it stays up here. The dura mater stays up here. Those are like tin foil. If you're wrapping some food and you wrap it in tin foil, it covers it. It's thick, it's durable, much like the dura mater, but it doesn't really suction to the food. Now the pia mater, that's like saran wrap. Saran wrap is going to suction very, very closely to that piece of food. And you can see here, that's exactly what the pia mater does. Couple more things to note is there's some different spaces. So I'm going to verbally state these as we go through them. There's the epidural space. I'll put ED for epidural. Let me just write out epidural here. That's the epidural space above the dura mater. There's also the subdural space. This space down in here below the dura mater is the subdural. The most important space, though, is this a subarachnoid space. This is where the CSF from the ventricles, where it's produced, travels to. So think ventricles produce the CSF, and it travels over to the subarachnoid space. And that's where you get a little bit of balance, a little bit of lubrication from the brain and the skull. So check that video out for a full look at the meninges. But if you're wondering where are the meninges other than the brain, the answer is that they're also surrounding the spinal cord. The other part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. So brain and spinal cord are surrounded by meninges. And here we can actually see those meninges. Let's go most deep first. This is the pia mater. This is the arachnoid mater. And this is the dura mater. So from deep to superficial, it spells pad, or superficial to deep, it spells depth. However you want to remember it, definitely remember the different levels of the meninges. And as we look at the spinal cord here, another video, lots of videos to help you out on these models that go completely through everything. We want to note that coming from the brain, right here, down the brainstem, it becomes the spinal cord. Spinal cord is going to travel all the way down your back to your pelvis, and that is where your spinal cord travels. But nerves branch off at every level of your vertebral column. And here we can actually see the nerves branching off at each level. So I like to think of the spinal cord as a hotel, one of those fancy, really tall hotels with the nice elevators. And I like to think of information being able to travel up and down the spinal cord, but it can stop at any level or any floor and get off at that floor. That's exactly what's going on with the spinal cord itself. So, for example, let's say you are going to move your arm, and your brain in your frontal lobe, which is where voluntary motor movement begins, sends a signal down your spinal cord, down to your arm. Now, let's say this is the arm level right here. It would get off at this level, travel out, synapse, travel back in. These are what are called the rami communicants after you went through the spinal nerve, and then travel out the ventral or dorsal ramus. This right here that it traveled out was the ventral ramus. The one back here is the dorsal ramus. Watch the full video to get all the anatomy of this model, but that is what's happening. Here we can see it from a superior view looking down. So we actually have to differentiate between the vertebral body of the vertebral column and the actual spinal cord itself. So here's the actual spinal cord. It's got white matter. It's got gray matter. And you can see A, B, C on the gray matter as the dorsal, lateral, and anterior horns of the gray matter. So note those differences between white and gray matter. Also notice the difference again between the spinal cord itself and then the spinal nerves branching off of it with recap question. What are these called inside this circle? Give you 5 seconds to think about what these are called inside the circle that I just drew. Pause the video if you need more time. Go back, watch the other video to get this, but I'll give you 5 seconds here. And those are called the rami communicants. Rami communicants. How about this one back here? Next one. Give you 5 seconds to think about it. What is that called? That's called the dorsal or posterior ramus. Dorsal posterior ramus. It would travel all the way to your back versus the ventral ramus. This one here would travel to your arms, to the front of your body. But let's take a closer look at how these spinal nerves get into and out of the spinal cord itself. So another video of another model. Got the model right here, classic spinal cord and vertebral column model. Now, when you're looking at this, I want you to think about, how do I know what's anterior versus posterior? That's what I'll throw out to you. Which side's anterior? Which side's posterior? Let me throw an A on this side and a B back here. You tell me which one is anterior, which one is posterior for A and B. Take a few seconds, maybe let's go 5 seconds on this one. Good 5 seconds. And if you said A was anterior and B was posterior, you would be correct. A has the vertebral body. Vertebral bodies are going to be anterior to the spinal cord. And you can start to see the spinous process, which was B. So knowing your vertebral column vertebrae anatomy is so important when it comes to the spinal cord. Here we can see what we're looking at. Spinous process, vertebral body out front. But continuing on here, take a look at where the spinal nerve, which would be this part here, it has a bubble. So this bubble, I'll put a circle inside of a circle, and this bubble is the DRG. DRG, I know that's really hard to read, but DRG, dorsal root ganglion. That's where all the cell bodies are going to be for the spinal nerve. You can see it over here as well. Let me try to write it a little bit better for you. There we go, DRG, dorsal root ganglion. Now, as this travels in, and let's say you touch something and you feel a sensation, that's going to come in and it's going to go through what's called the dorsal root. So if you watch the video, hopefully this is a recap of anatomy, but now we're adding in some physiology. The sensory information travels through the dorsal root and goes posterior into the spinal cord. Now we're in the gray matter in here, right? So we got the dorsal horn. We can see the lateral horns here, the anterior horns out here. That's just how information is going to travel. Now at this point, it might go up to the brain. It might go down to another level, or it might go back out, what's called the anterior root or the ventral root, as it travels out to the spinal nerve. That's a long way of saying information travels in the posterior side and out the anterior side. So think posterior in, anterior out. And one last spinal cord model for you here. I got it right here in the lab. Tons of models to show you. But this one does a great job of taking away the vertebral column and just showing you the nervous tissue. Now, you can really see things like number 24, the DRG, dorsal root ganglion. That one is super obvious, and it will tell you that this side back here is posterior, because dorsal means posterior, and that will tell you wherever that big bubble is the posterior side. So we can see the posterior root, dorsal root, either one. You can use posterior or dorsal, traveling into the spinal cord. But as everything else in this video, there's been another video for it. So check out the other video on this spinal cord video. All right, take a break if you need to. Try to let that all soak in, because we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how you travel vertically, up or down on the spinal cord. And the way that you do that are on what are called spinal tracts. So outside of the gray matter in the spinal cord, there are different spinal tracts. There's a lot of them, but for this course, we're going to summarize it with 3 spinal tracts. There's 2 ascending tracts, which means it takes information up to the brain, and 1 descending tract, which means it takes it down. So as you can see here, the first one is the dorsal column. This is an area in the posterior part of the spinal cord that will send light touch and pressure information up to the brain. Now here's a deep, deep level question going all the way back to the skin lab. What receptors in the skin would deal with light touch and pressure? I'm going to give you 10 seconds because this one requires you to go all the way back to the beginning of the semester to answer. So you tell me what receptors pick up light touch and pressure. All right, if you're thinking light touch, Meissner's corpuscle, you would be correct. Deep pressure would be Pacinian, but this says light, so it's Meissner's corpuscle. So imagine touching something lightly. A Meissner's corpuscle picks that up, sends it into your spinal cord, and then it travels up a dorsal column to get to the brain to tell your brain that you just felt some light touch on your fingertips. That's how information gets from your hand to your brain to be processed. If it does not get to your brain, you will not feel that. And this really speaks to the power of the brain. It can tell you you're feeling something when you're actually not, or you could be feeling something with the receptors, but if your brain doesn't process it, you won't feel it. And sometimes I wish that would happen with this next one. It's the pain and temperature. So pain, temperature, we're talking the free nerve endings of the skin, and it would take it in and it would travel up these areas here, the spinal thalamic tract. So the spinal thalamic tract deals with pain and temperature, ascending, going up to the brain to tell you you're in pain or you're feeling some heavy temperature. Switch the direction. Now we're going down from that frontal lobe, because this does motor movement. Frontal lobe is motor movement. From this lobe to send it down to your arms, your legs, wherever that signal might go, it's going down what's called the corticospinal tract. So corticospinal, it's over here, a little bit on the lateral side, and it's going to send motor movement down the spinal cord. All right, that's a lot to say. That's how information and motor movement gets up and down the spinal cord. I like to call these spinal tracts elevators, because I want you to separate this type of information, light touch, pain and temperature, motor movement, from a different type of information or signal, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. So when we think sympathetic nervous system, we're talking fight or flight. And in this scenario, or response to something that causes you to want to run or fight, or have a release of all those hormones and neurotransmitters associated with the sympathetic nervous system, where does it actually originate from? Well, the answer is it originates from the levels T1 to L2, meaning spinal cord levels T1 to L2 are going to have the original or the origin, so the origin of the sympathetic nervous system. And the origin of the sympathetic nervous system are the lateral horns. So only T1 to L2, what we call the thoracolumbar region, has the lateral horns and can produce a signal for the sympathetic nervous system. And your book does a great job of telling you all about how this is produced and that sort of stuff. But here's the thing. Just like we had elevators, spinal tracts, for this previous information, we have to have a way to vertically move the sympathetic nervous system. And that's through the sympathetic trunks. So we're looking at this model here. These out here in front, these are the sympathetic trunks. And as we can see here, they are outside of the spinal cord, not within the spinal cord like the spinal tracts were. These are outside, and they almost look like staircases. So much like the elevators are in the middle of the hotel, but the staircases are, you got to kind of search for them, right? You got to go down the back hallway to get to the staircases. That's what's going on with these sympathetic trunks. Now, a couple quick ways that this could happen is that when it originates from the lateral horn, it could come out and go across the spinal nerve, out the anterior root, out the rami communicans, over to what's called the sympathetic ganglion. Anytime you see a bubble, it's a ganglion. And let's say you want to innervate your eye. Remember that pupillary light reflex? That's the sympathetic nervous system. But T1, your spinal cord is way down here. So how do you get from here to here? The answer, the sympathetic trunks. So you would travel up the sympathetic trunk until you get to the eyeball level. And in this case, sympathetic nervous system would dilate your pupil. It would let more light in. So one of the ways the sympathetic nervous system works with the sympathetic trunks is by taking it up. Additionally, if you go up, you can also go down. That's another way. A third way, you can go out and then right back in and stay at the same level. So you can go up, down, stay at the same level. Those are all ways that the sympathetic nervous system could work. And I am referencing these things right here. Again, in your book, it summarizes all these. There's a fourth way here, though, that we can come in out to your intestines. So don't forget about the intestines being innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And that's what's going on here with that pathway. Getting there. And just like doing a surgery that might be hours and hours long, it might take you hours and hours to really understand some of these central nervous system things, because it's deeper. It's more just finding out where it's at, what it does in the brain and spinal cord. So take some time on these. Pause this video, go back as needed to review some of these things. But we are on to the reflex arc next. So a lot of what we did before wasn't really motor, but now we're going to do something with motor. And this is the classic going to the doctor's office, getting a reflex hammer, hitting it on the knee, and the knee kicks out. You've probably all done that before, but the question is why? Why does hitting your knee or right below your knee cause your leg to kick out? And if you watch this video, I'll explain why. I'll give you the brief summary here, but the full summary is in that video. And the brief summary is that your muscles don't want to be stretched rapidly. And if you remember from the muscle lab, the quadriceps insert into the tibia. And if you hit that patellar tendon, it stretches the tendon, which stretches the muscle. And that muscle sends a signal after you have the receptor, sends a signal all the way up via a sensory or afferent neuron to the spinal cord. And this is where we're going in the posterior side. Remember this model here, going through that posterior side, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root into the gray matter. And this information gets integrated within the spinal cord. So I want you to differentiate going up to the brain and being integrated in the spinal cord. Why would you want to integrate it in the spinal cord if your brain is really the thing that processes this information? Well, these reflexes are designed to protect your body. Things like touching a hot stove, hitting your finger in the car door, or in this case, being rapidly stretched, need a response fast. So this is the way that the body gives you a quick response to protect you or pull your hand off of that stove. So what happens is it gets integrated in the spinal cord. Immediately, a signal is sent out via an efferent neuron carrying motor information back to the effector, or in this case, a muscle, to contract. This happens so fast that you don't even think about it. Think of a time when you touched something hot. You probably pulled your hand away before you even felt it was hot. That's because a signal was sent into your spinal cord that you're touching something hot, but then a motor response was sent out, pulling your arm away before that pain and temperature information got to your brain. Recap question. What spinal tract takes pain and temperature information up to your brain? Give you 5 seconds on this one. All right, pain and temperature here. What is the spinal nerve tract that takes it up? If you said spinal thalamic, you'd be correct. Spinal thalamic takes pain and temperature up to the brain. And that's a reflex arc. Knowing the arc will help you with all the reflexes. So there's reflexes like the Babinski reflex, where a baby might flare their toes in response to stroking the bottom of the foot. Now, no adult would do that. An adult would, curl their toes or do nothing, right? But in a baby under a certain age, it will have this reflex. Here it is right here. Now, this is a primitive reflex. So primitive means at a certain age, you no longer have it. But if you have damage to the spine or the brain, you could revert back to this reflex. So a patient might come in from a car accident and you test the Babinski reflex to see if parts of their brain have been damaged. Full video on the reflexes of the biceps, of the triceps, of the knee, of the ankle. All the reflexes are found in this reflex video. The first part of the video is reflexes, like the motor reflexes. The second part are the cranial nerve reflexes. We've done those before. We also called those reflexes because they are, but now we're doing the motor reflexes. And lastly, to finish this PowerPoint lab discussion video up, just a quick overview of the Meninges model that you see in your book. So use this to your advantage as needed. All right, this has been your lab discussion on the brain, spinal cord, and the central nervous system. That's all for this week. I got to get back to the brain surgery. Thanks for watching.